We're in a country with vast resources, vast expertise, yet we're looking at 100,000 dead. Sir, how on earth did we get here?
Every death that we've experienced is a tragedy.
Tonight, a Dateline response. At what point did you realize that there was a freight train coming down the rail at us?
Very early on.
We weren't prepared. We weren't even getting prepared.
It was like a ticking time bomb. Catastrophic failure.
We uncover insider emails, White House documents, and for the first time in detail, lay out the pandemic playbook that might have changed everything. Could lives have been saved?
Equivalent to lost lives.
Do you not ask what mistakes were made, what things should have been done? Why was there not more urgency?
You can't imagine a greater sense of urgency.
The Playbook. Good evening, I'm Lester Holt. With the nation's attention turned to George Floyd's death and demonstrations across the country calling for equal, pandemic remains rampant and deadly. In fact, as the country opens up, some states are seeing an alarming surge in cases. Tonight, we look back on how it all began and ask the White House, did it really have to get this bad?
It's getting really bad here. This is something we've never seen before.
Please do whatever you need to do. But please do not let me die.
The cost of COVID-19 has been staggering. More than 100,000 people in the U.S. have died. 2 million have gotten sick, and tens of millions of people have lost their jobs. The devastation has been unimaginable. But back in 2016, a team of White House insiders did imagine the devastation. That's why they wrote this, a 69-page government document stamped with the seal of the President's office. It is a step-by-step guide for White House officials, a playbook to stop a pandemic in its tracks.
So the intent with the playbook was, here are the things you...
With no disrespect for anyone, would it be fair to call the playbook Pandemic for Dummies?
I think that it could be called Pandemics for Dummies.
Tonight, we are going to crack open the playbook and investigate what could have been done to fight the virus. Then, we'll show you what actually happened. It can be hard to remember what lifetime of new beginnings. A high school student had just celebrated her Sweet 16 in Queens, New York.
She had the time of her life. She danced throughout the whole night.
A young mother from South Georgia was training for a new job. And a singer from New Jersey who'd gotten her big break on The Voice was planning a
dream.
It's lives like these the playbook was written to protect. Lives that would be knocked off course by a virus out of control. COVID-19 first reared its head in Wuhan, China. But as January got underway in Washington, D.C., most talk of China involved trade deals, and Congress was gearing up for President Trump's impeachment.
In January, there were questions about how bad this was going to be. And
Dr. Beth Cameron, who talked to me from home, was the playbook's chief author. She is a highly regarded health security expert who has worked for both Republican and Democratic presidents. When you guys wrote the playbook, was your intention that it was going to be the, in case of fire, break glass, this is what you want to use?
The purpose of this document...
With varying degrees of urgency, presidents have prepared this country for a pandemic.
They can kill those who are young and healthy as well as those who are frail and sick.
The Trump administration has produced a number of detailed pandemic plans too, and just last year ran a multi-state pandemic exercise. But the authors of the playbook say their guide was different. It was meant to be a simplified road government plans, a tool to save time. Because in a pandemic, time equals lives.
These are very unusual events.
Jeremy Konondike, an expert in international disasters, helped coordinate the government's response to Ebola. He watched what was going on in China with increasing alarm. You were part of this team that had written this playbook. At this point, is it now become...
Here was we needed to move to a no-regrets posture in the United States.
In other words, prepare for the worst. In early January, the Centers for Disease Control set up a team to monitor the outbreak. On January 9th, they got word from China COVID-19 was a disease we hadn't seen in humans before, what's known as a novel pathogen. That's the type of painted threat level, and prompt questions like, do we have access to biological samples of the disease, critical to making tests and vaccines? But there were concerns the CDC wasn't acting fast enough. 3 weeks went by, and according to this email written by a top government scientist, the CDC hadn't officially asked China for samples yet. That's efforts were made, but China was uncooperative. At what point did you realize that there was a freight train coming down the rail at us?
So very early on, this virus had very serious features that raised concerns to me.
Dr. Luciana Borio has spent her career studying infectious diseases. Up until last year, when she left for the private sector, she monitored the Trump White House.
I couldn't imagine a situation where we would not have already had cases circulating in the U.S., given the amount of travel that takes place between our two countries.
Were our policymakers slow in recognizing the reality of the situation?
You know, Lester, it's very difficult to know. I had left the White House in 2019. My sense is that it's important to be necessarily trained in public health and infectious diseases.
NBC News has learned a number of people were trying to catch the attention of policymakers early on. Ken Delanian, who covers national security for NBC News, says the intelligence community started flagging the virus in December. In January, the virus was included in the president's daily brief.
Some of the highest level intelligence gathered in one place in the government. It was included in that brief more than a dozen times.
The White House has said there were no explicit warnings in those briefings, and it's unclear if the president ever read them. We do know that on January 21st, the CDC announced the first known case of coronavirus in the United States. The next day, President Trump gave CNBC.
Are the words about a pandemic at this point?
No, we're not at all, and we have it totally under control.
The Playbook authors weren't so sure. They wanted to know what the government was doing about testing and getting hospitals and healthcare workers ready for what would be the fight of their lives. I realize they're speaking in hindsight, but what do you think was the first major mistake by the administration?
Is the magical thinking that we saw in January and February that somehow a virus that could ravage China to the degree that we saw playing out in front of our eyes was somehow unlikely to pose the same risks here?
Coming up, another mistake was just around the corner. We found out that the U.S. did not have a working test.
I was really surprised.
We're even getting prepared.
By the end of January, the Playbook's color-coded charts would have been flashing red. China had put the entire city of Wuhan, a city the size of President Trump, banned entry to this country for foreign nationals who'd recently traveled to China. You know, the president says by restricting travel from China, he saved a lot of lives. Does the evidence support that?
It's definitely possible that the travel ban did save a number of cases from coming into this country. But Lester, there were already cases here.
We know America's first official in mid-January. NBC News has analyzed flight data collected by FlightAware, an aviation intelligence company, and determined that as many as 8,000 people flew here directly from Wuhan in January. How many of them brought the virus? We don't know. Where did those people go? Who did they infect? We don't know that either. Playbook author, Dr. Beth Cameron.
This is epidemiology 101. This is how you stop an outbreak from becoming an epidemic or a pandemic.
Dr. Luciana Borio, the infectious disease expert and former White House insider, agrees. She wrote about the need for widespread testing in a Wall Street Journal op-ed in late January. You were beating the drum for
Sick. We don't know how many are sick. We can't act. We can't isolate.
On page 32 of the Playbook, the authors address testing, asking if the states have diagnostic capability and capacity sufficient to trace and monitor for an outbreak. The answer, in January and early February, would have been no. The only lab in the U.S. that could run a COVID, it wasn't until February 6th, 17 days after the discovery of the first case here, that the CDC shared testing kits with selected labs. 2 days later, they got bad news. Many of those test kits didn't work. We found out that the U.S. did not have a working test, which cost some valuable time.
I was really surprised that the United States had so much trouble with testing capability across the country. I think the real problem in this case was the failure to understand that it was happening and the failure to come up with a backup plan.
Labs like this one might have been a big part of any backup plan.
Unfortunately, the CDC test, you had a perfect storm, and so we got late for testing.
In Medicine Virology Lab in Seattle. Even before that first CDC test failed, Greninger's lab had already started developing its own test for COVID-19, but it needed permission from the FDA to use it.
There was a frustration that there were going to be a lot of requirements. We just knew that it was going to cost time.
When weeks passed with no tests from the CDC, lobbied Congress for help in cutting through the red tape. In late February, Greninger's lab got the green light they'd been looking for.
And so within about 72 hours, we were live for testing.
That was progress, but CDC guidance limited testing to people exhibiting symptoms or travelers from infected areas. On the other hand, South Korea identified their first case on the same day, February. By the end of that month, South Korea had tested nearly 100,000 people. The U.S., 472.
We weren't prepared. We weren't even getting prepared.
Though COVID-19 had been here since at least January, Konyndyk says that in mid-February, he learned firsthand that some members of the administration still normal meeting. There were science experts, there were some folks from the White House. What can you tell us about that conversation?
They were not talking about measures that they were taking to prepare the homeland. They were not talking about hospital preparedness. They were not talking about planning for social distancing measures or anything like that. Virtually everything that they were talking about was the travel ban, the quarantines of returning travelers, traveler screening.
This was killing Americans long before any widespread testing began. Autopsy results have revealed that a San Jose woman had died of COVID-19 on February 6th, the same day the CDC's faulty tests went out. As the calendar flipped from the lost month of February to March, most Americans' lives as if nothing had changed. That was certainly true of the people we've met. That teenager from Queens, remember, was counting the days to spring break. In Europe, that singer from New Jersey was living her dream on tour. And in Albany, Georgia, that young mom was feeling on top of the world.
February, I would say that I was living my best life at that particular time.
None of them suspecting that an invisible killer was stalking them. Coming up.
I understand that disruption to everyday life may be severe.
A warning from a CDC official and a White House backlash.
Trump reportedly, according to our sources, was angry at her candor.
When
we have it totally under control.
The immediate risk to the general American public remains low.
It's going to disappear. One day it's like a miracle. It will disappear.
The job of tracking pandemics was once head Security Council. But Trump officials disbanded that office in 2018 and reassigned the staff. They say the reorganization didn't result in a loss of expertise. But NBC News' Ken Delanian says it came at a cost.
There were biodefense experts who remained at the NSC in other offices, but there was nobody at a senior level who could have the president's ear
Trump officials say they were following their own highly detailed pandemic response plans and insist those plans were more useful than the playbook. But Jeremy Konundike says we still weren't moving fast enough.
I think if we'd been following the playbook, there would have been planning underway from late January for the kind of physical distancing measures that might need to be applied.
Alarm bells were going off. Since January, officials from the CDC, Homeland Security, and other federal agencies had been talking to outside experts who warned we were falling behind. In an email chain with the subject line, Red Dawn, they discuss what we should be doing. A senior medical advisor with Veterans Affairs wrote, I would drop almost NPIs. That medical jargon covers social distancing. A researcher noted, we need the citizens to know and practice social distancing. And then on February 25th, someone said it out loud. A CDC official made a pretty notable and alarming statement to reporters.
Yes, Dr. Nancy Messonnier, who at the time was the head of the CDC's Task Their Own Lives.
I understand this whole situation may seem overwhelming and that disruption to everyday life may be severe. But these are things that people need to start thinking about now.
Dr. Messonnier's phone call with reporters came as China and Italy were already facing lockdowns and severe disruptions. Businesses closed, economies tanking, market took a dive.
And there was a backlash. Trump reportedly, according to our sources, was angry at her candor and wanted her muzzled. We don't think that she was muzzled, but she never again put things in such stark terms.
And the next day, the president, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, and a different senior CDC official dedicated an...
Thank you, Mr. President, for...
Alex Azar, Secretary of Health and Human Services, tried to refocus on the travel ban.
The president's early and decisive actions, including travel restrictions, have succeeded in buying us incredibly valuable time.
At that same news conference, the president announced a change.
I'm going to be putting our Vice President, Mike Pence, in charge.
But the person who took charge at that brief...
Saying less than 500 people. Are you planning to test more people?
Well, we're testing everybody that we need to test. And we're finding very little problem.
This was the first of many news conferences where the president would take center stage.
Some of the doctors say it will wash through, it will flow through.
What does the playbook tell us about messaging, about communicating to the American people?
The playbook, single, clear, designated, science-based communicators.
In the absence of a clear, consistent message, Americans continue to pack into restaurants, movies, offices, airplanes, and churches.
Never in a million years did I think the disease that started in China would not only reach Albany, Georgia, but...
In Albany, Georgia, about 3 hours south of Atlanta. In early March, she was asked to perform for a youth program at a local church. 4 days later, Terica was sick with COVID-19.
I was in so much pain that it caused me to get in the middle of my bed in a fetal position.
Terica had fallen victim to an outbreak that hit Little Albany, Georgia, like a tsunami. Health officials believe someone sick from out of town had brought it to a funeral in late February. Some of those mourners also attended Terica's church performance. Now, in the hospital and deep in misery, she started a video diary.
I want to be able to hug my kids. Lord, please, please, just give me my life back. Please, God.
The outbreak killed more than 140 people in and around Albany. We saw how fast this could move. South Georgia, a bunch of people attend a funeral. Hundreds get sick. Some die. How could that have been avoided?
Well, that could have been avoided if we had...
Spreading events that caused the virus to run wild, beginning in February. Services at a synagogue in New Rochelle, New York. A corporate conference in Boston. A series of family gatherings in Chicago. A choir practice near Seattle. And 2 massive gatherings, Mardi Gras and Spring Break in Florida. Could lives have been saved
during any pandemic is equivalent to lost lives.
By mid-March, events would start moving at warp speed. The virus had taken aim at New York City, and everything the Playbook was designed to prevent was coming to pass. Coming up,
we will be suspending all travel from Europe.
Was that a moment in which you felt a little better about messaging?
Address.
As the coronavirus rampaged through the country in early March, few Americans seemed to be paying close attention. Then came March 11th.
You see the teams heading back.
The NBA suspended its season. Tom Hanks posted that he and his wife were positive too, and President Trump went on primetime TV.
To keep new cases from entering our shores, we will be suspending all travel from Europe to the United States for the next 30 days.
Americans abroad began the scramble home, crushing together in airport. An urgent call from her husband.
He's freaking out, and he's like, "You have to get home. I will fly you home."
We now know the virus had been flowing into New York from Europe unchecked for weeks, and the president's second travel ban did nothing to satisfy the Playbook's authors. Was that a moment in which you felt a little better about messaging?
No, I was actually very, very on was building up our public health capability in the States and building up our capacity to test.
But the president offered no specific policy to curtail the spread of the virus inside the U.S. as cities and states began closing down.
There was a lot of inconsistency in when different cities and different states began to employ stay-at-home orders. In San Francisco on the one hand and New York City on the other hand.
The Playbook was written, its authors say, because days matter when fighting a pandemic. The federal government began recommending social distancing on March 16th. Modeling from Columbia University suggests if the government had acted even a week earlier, 36,000 lives might have been saved. The cost of waiting in
Sources that I talked to in public safety and city government say that the real issue here was a failure of imagination.
Tom Winter, an NBC News correspondent for investigations, has been covering New York's response to the pandemic since early January.
It wasn't thinking about the tourists that were coming in from Europe that might have had the virus. It's not thinking about those subways that are going to be packed with riders, one person on top of the other person.
Drew Cuomo and the city's mayor, Bill de Blasio, hesitated to close down the nation's largest school system. And there were more than 16,000 confirmed cases in New York before a stay-at-home order took effect. Since then, the mayor and governor have defended their actions, saying they moved as fast as possible during an unprecedented crisis and were hampered by a lack of support and...
No question that the actions taken by the governor and the mayor in shutting down New York City when they did helped save lives, but there's also the possibility that some of their early inaction cost lives as well.
Carla Duarte was one of those New York City students who'd been attending school up to the middle of March. A few months back, she'd celebrated her Sweet 16 with a huge party, wearing a dress she adored. But in mid-March, Carla began to feel tired. A cough, chills, and fever followed. Carla's mom, Anna, became seriously concerned.
And I told my husband, I said, let's get ready. Let's get ready and take her to the emergency room.
Carla was diagnosed with the virus. Things went downhill quickly. Within days, she was moved to the intensive care unit.
Mommy, when this is going to be over? And I saw that she was really suffocating.
When a ventilator didn't help Carla, the head nurse told Anna her daughter could go on an ECMO, a breathing machine of last resort.
And she said, but this is like 50-50. 50-50.
How could it have come to New York City Hospital that was itself on the front lines of a worsening war? Coming up, the mad scramble for masks. Where was the safety equipment? Who or what is to blame for the shortage during this crisis?
All I can say is we are not prepared. Even now, it's a catastrophic failure.
when Dateline continued.
We are reusing N95 masks and our shields.
And honestly, it's pretty terrifying. We're all getting exposed.
We have to risk possibly our own lives and the lives of our families to be able to take care of our patients. And it's not a position any of us should be put in.
Of all the personal protective equipment, PPE to frontline workers may be the most egregious. Could it have been anticipated that all 50 states would suddenly have this urgent demand for PPE at the very same time?
I think we absolutely could have anticipated that all 50 states would have needs at some point during this, the outbreak, which ultimately became a pandemic.
If the administration had been following the playbook, it would have determined there wasn't enough PPE in January. But in January and February, the U.S. sent PPE overseas, like this 18-ton shipment to China in February, on the day the World Health Organization warned of a global PPE shortage. And while the federal government started the procurement process, the first order of new N95 masks wasn't placed until March 12th. We are continuing to see a debate playing out right now about who's in charge, who orders equipment, the feds or the states. What did you conclude in your preparation of the playbook?
So what we said in the playbook is, yes, there is a lot of authority that exists at the state and local level, but there will also be
Inside the White House, the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, was running his own task force, taking on the PPE problem by recruiting private sector leaders like Eric Ries, a quick startup guru. March 21st, you get a call from a Silicon Valley friend. What were you asked to do?
The initial request was to build a website that could match the supply and demand of
E-Crisis needed more than just a website. He saw a need to coordinate all the public and private efforts, the manufacturers, health insurers, financiers, and grassroots organizations already plugging the gaps. So he launched the PPE Coalition, connecting makers of PPE with those who needed it most. Reese, the son of two doctors, eased supply from drying up.
I don't know how to explain how it felt. It was like a ticking time bomb.
Reese thought his work would be a stopgap measure until the government took over coordinating PPE on a national scale.
We always thought the cavalry was coming.
But that didn't happen. He says he reached out to the government and Kushner's task force, but didn't get a response. Tens of volunteers. You've cautioned against judging right now, but I do have to ask you from your perspective, who or what is to blame for the shortage of PPE during this crisis?
It's a question above my pay grade and over my head. All I can say is we are not prepared, even now, as a society, for this problem. And it's not even close. It's not like we got a B-, and we almost did it. It's
together what was called the Playbook. And one of the things they stressed in their planning was that PPE should have been part of the planning even in January. Does it disappoint you that didn't happen?
The first time I heard that, I was outraged and shocked.
The White House has said their own plans were more robust than the Playbook, and recently pointed to a pandemic exercise they ran last year.
We did a full exercise on pandemic action report put together.
The exercise she's talking about was a pandemic war game called Crimson Contagion that tested government response in a flu pandemic scenario. We spoke to people who participated and obtained a draft after-action report. We learned that the exercise exposed vulnerabilities in the system, with leadership, states getting federal help, and problems that didn't get fixed before the real pandemic hit, and that might have been averted using the Playbook written years earlier. And to critics who say it is outdated, that other policies have superseded it, you say what?
I would say the playbook is not outdated. Look at the questions that it asks. I think they're completely relevant today.
At this snapshot in time, what grade would you give the Trump?
Honestly, Lester, I would have to give them a failing grade at this point.
Coming up, we're looking at 100,000 dead in this country. Sir, how on earth did we get here?
Every death that we've experienced is a tragedy.
The White House responds. A viral outbreak here had been largely ignored. So in that vacuum, the virus was able to write a playbook of its own, random and cruel. Felicia Temple, whose talents got noticed after appearing on The Voice, has witnessed that firsthand. We told you she was a singer. What we didn't tell you is that colleagues and patients at her old hospital, Holy Name Medical Center in Teaneck, New Jersey. She's seen this highly infectious disease keep families from the bedsides of loved ones. You have to essentially stand in as a surrogate for family.
Yes, absolutely. I had a young woman and she had a do not resuscitate order. And the other nurse said, I'm sure that there's something that we her hand and let's just pray over her. And she did go and it was terrible.
Sometimes the patients have been people she's known for years and loved.
My heart just dropped because he's a hospital treasure.
75-year-old Jesus Villaluz was a patient transporter, ferrying the sick from room to room until he became at the very hospital he dedicated himself to.
As they wheeled him out of the unit, all of the staff lined the walls while his body went past, just to pay tribute to him.
This moment of Jesus's body being carried through the hospital has become an iconic image of the sacrifices made by healthcare workers during this pandemic. Lives lost, the president has consistently said the government's response has been a success. Secretary of Health and Human Services Alex Azar echoed that when he sat down with me for an interview 2 weeks ago. We're in a country with vast resources, vast expertise, yet we're looking at 100,000 dead in this country, the most infections of any country. Sir, how on earth did we get here?
Our numbers are large, our country is large also, and every death that we've experienced is a tragedy. But we're testing now in historic numbers. The more you test, of course, the more you're going to identify in terms of cases.
But back to my question of how we got here, do you not ask what mistakes were made, what things should have been done, the timing? Do those things keep you up at night?
China should have been more transparent, open, and cooperative, I'll tell you that much. China's symptomatic transmission, yet they concealed that.
But by early January, they had acknowledged a novel coronavirus was out there. Should the U.S. have been taking steps right from the get-go to work on things like personal protection equipment, set up testing procedures to identify where it is?
We, in fact, did every one of those things. We scaled up the National Security Council at the White House. We put in place an emergency operations team at the Seed Group that was working on vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics. We reached out to personal protective equipment manufacturers and began the process to scale up domestic manufacturing.
But the first purchase orders for PPE weren't issued by the government until March. Why did that not occur earlier?
Well, that's not actually true. We were procuring N95 respirators earlier in late January and early February with the money that we had. And then
but it did not provide any. Our own search of government databases found no federal orders for N95 masks before March. Were you aware of the 2016 pandemic playbook?
Oh, of course. We were presented with the Obama administration's rather thin pandemic playbook, and we found that inadequate, and we in the Trump administration actually lost.
Then again, the playbook's authors say it was meant to be a concise guide, so leaders could act quickly during a crisis. And there is overlap between the playbook and the administration's plans. But some of the things in that playbook were mirrored in your own work, this administration's work, and yet they weren't done. Did the administration ignore some of its own work, its own findings on dealing with it? In our interview, Secretary Azar pointed again to the China travel ban. But the secretary does concede one delay. He says time was lost when the CDC, which reports to him, failed to get working test kits out quickly to public health labs. South Korea had its first coronavirus confirmed case the same day the United States did, but by the time we distributed the U.S., only 472. How did that happen?
So South Korea had an admirable response, and we should give them credit for it. They're a much smaller country. They also had a very localized outbreak, and because of different approaches to public health, they were able to isolate all of those individuals.
You're saying that the South Korea model is not reflective of the U.S. experience in That there's nothing there to be replicated?
Oh, I think that as we move forward, novel coronavirus, something, a pandemic like this, our testing system in the United States was not built for that.
But the need to test was laid out in your own exercises, this administration's exercise, as well as that 2016 playbook, wasn't it?
Well, most of the pandemic planning had been around pandemic flu. Remember, you have a novel pathogen, coronavirus here, a totally novel one. You've got to get the private sector to develop across the country.
The secretary says the federal government's overall efforts save lives, including its recommendations on social distancing issued in March. But could we have acted faster? As you know, recently there was some modeling that suggested that had there been an earlier response, even a week earlier, it might have saved tens of thousands of lives. Do you accept those?
Data is indicating that New York was seeded by cases coming over from Italy and from Europe. And had New York City, New York State taken action sooner to engage in community mitigation efforts, that certainly could have slowed the spread of disease.
New York officials have said they lacked federal direction early on. Azar points out that the administration had to weigh closures against the impact to the economy and to Americans who this president has risen to all those challenges. The president has often been at odds with his own scientists, and there have been, let's face it, some conflicting signals coming from government. Do you regret any of that? Do you wish that he had not done some of the things that he has done?
The president hasn't been at odds with his public health advisors. He works closely with them. He takes their advice.
But he's been rooting on states, calling on states to open up, how to safely open up. That's not being at odds with your scientists?
Well, the guidelines are guidelines. They're simply a potential markers for how one would progress to reopening. But each governor knows the lay of the land in their state better.
As states adjust to a new normal, the people most impacted by the virus, like Ana Duarte, can't help but look back and think about the what-ifs. She warned Carla from becoming infected. And speaking of Carla,
I heard the nurse talking to my mom, and then eventually, I started opening my eyes.
Despite being so sick and on a ventilator, Carla eventually rallied, and on April 19th, got the all clear to go home. The virus has disproportionately killed people of color in this country. Terica Parks feels lucky to be among the survivors.
My mind yes, this is it. I'm going home.
She says the day she left the hospital felt like a rebirth of sorts.
It almost brought tears to the other side, outside from behind that hospital window.
Safe to say, we all want to be on the other side of this. Far less certain exactly when that will be. Now, maybe we should be writing a new kind of playbook. One that points us away from the next disaster by understanding how we handle everything we got wrong. That's all for this special edition of Dateline. I'm Lester Holt. Thanks for watching.
The Unread Playbook, an in-depth analysis of the initial American response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Forward. In the early months of 2020, the world watched as a novel coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2, began its inexorable march across the globe. What started as a localized outbreak in Wuhan, China, rapidly escalated into the most significant global public health crisis in a century. Nations were tested, economies were shattered, and societies were fundamentally altered. The United States, a nation with unparalleled scientific expertise, vast economic resources, and a deep well of intellectual capital, found itself facing a catastrophe of staggering proportions, ultimately leading to the highest death toll of any country in the world. This report is not an exercise in assigning blame with the benefit of hindsight. The fog of war is a real phenomenon in any crisis, particularly one involving a novel pathogen where information is scarce and evolving. Decisions are made under immense pressure, with incomplete data. However, preparedness is the act of piercing that fog. It is the discipline of imagining the unimaginable, of planning for the improbable, and of building resilient systems that can function under duress. The central thesis of this analysis is that the tragic outcomes of the early U.S. response were not inevitable. They were the result of a cascade of systemic failures. A failure of imagination, a failure of leadership, a failure of logistics, and a failure of communication. At the heart of this story lies a crucial document, a 69-page pandemic playbook developed by a bipartisan group of experts within the government. It was designed to be a clear, concise guide for the very crisis that unfolded. It was a fire alarm waiting to be pulled. This analysis seeks to understand why that alarm was never heeded. We will deconstruct the critical decisions made and not made from the first whispers of the virus to the moment it overwhelmed the nation's healthcare system. By examining the timeline, the internal communications, the scientific realities, and the human consequences, we will piece together a comprehensive picture of a nation caught unprepared, not for a lack of warning, but for a lack of will to listen. The stories of individuals, a teenage girl fighting for her life in a Queens hospital, a nurse returning to the front lines in New Jersey, a young mother struck down in a small Georgia town are not anecdotes. They are the human cost of a playbook left on the shelf. The purpose of this deep dive is to provide an honest accounting, to learn from the missteps, and to ensure that when the next pandemic threat emerges, as it surely will, the lessons from this crisis will form the foundation of a more robust, decisive, and humane response. The playbook was written once. It must not be ignored again. Executive Summary. This report provides a detailed analysis of the initial United States response to the COVID-19 pandemic, focusing on the critical period from December 2019 through the spring of 2020. It argues that the severe outcomes experienced by the nation were not an unavoidable consequence of a novel virus, but rather the result of a series of preventable failures rooted in a disregard for established preparedness protocols, most notably the 2016 Playbook for Early Response to High-Consequence Emerging Infectious Disease Threats. Key findings: a failure of preparedness and imagination. Despite years of warnings from public health experts and the existence of multiple pandemic plans, including the aforementioned Playbook and the Crimson Contagion exercise, the U.S. government entered 2020 with a diminished and fragmented pandemic response infrastructure. The 2018 dissolution of the National Security Council's dedicated Pandemic Response Unit removed a critical coordinating body from the White House, leaving a vacuum of senior-level expertise. The clear warnings from exercises like Crimson Contagion, which highlighted vulnerabilities in supply chains, testing capacity, and federal-state coordination, went largely unaddressed. The critical lost months of January and February. Early intelligence warnings about a novel coronavirus in Wuhan, China, which began in December 2019 and were reportedly included in the president's daily brief numerous times in January, failed to trigger an urgent, whole-of-government response. The administration's public posture during this period was one of dismissal and overconfidence, characterizing the virus as a distant and controllable threat. This magical thinking led to a crucial loss of time that could have been used for scaling up testing, procuring personal protective equipment, PPE, and preparing the public and the healthcare system for the coming impact. The catastrophic breakdown of testing. The single most significant failure of the early response was the inability to develop and deploy widespread diagnostic testing. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, encountered technical flaws with its initial test kits, but a more profound failure lay in the regulatory bureaucracy that prevented private and academic labs from deploying their own validated tests for weeks. This testing vacuum meant the United States was flying blind. The virus spread undetected and untracked, making effective contact tracing and containment impossible. By the end of February, while South Korea had tested nearly 100,000 people, the U.S. had tested fewer than 500. This is Epidemiology 101, and it was a test the nation failed. Supply chain collapse and the PPE crisis. The federal government's failure to anticipate and address the inevitable surge in demand for PPE was a direct consequence of ignoring the Playbook's directives. The strategic national stockpile was inadequately supplied, and the administration was slow to leverage the Defense Production Act or coordinate a national procurement strategy. This inaction forced states into a chaotic and competitive open market, driving up prices and creating critical shortages. The burden fell on frontline healthcare workers who were forced to reuse single-use masks, wear trash bags for gowns, and risk their lives to care for the sick, leading to a collapse of morale and an amplification of the crisis. Inconsistent and politicized communication. Effective crisis management requires clear, consistent, and credible communication from a trusted, science-based source. The Playbook explicitly calls for this. Instead, the American public received a cacophony of conflicting messages. Scientific advice from agencies like the CDC was often contradicted or downplayed by political leaders. The daily White House press briefings frequently became platforms for misinformation, creating confusion about the severity of the virus, the efficacy of masks, and the timeline for reopening. This erosion of public trust hampered the implementation of vital public health measures like social distancing. Conclusion. The narrative that the COVID-19 pandemic surprised the whole world is a dangerous simplification. The threat was known, the response strategies were documented, and the warnings were issued. The failure was not in the absence of a plan, but in the refusal to execute it. The subsequent chapters of this report will expand on these findings in granular detail, demonstrating how each of these failures compounded the others, leading to a national tragedy that cost hundreds of thousands of lives and left an indelible scar on the nation. The ultimate lesson is that pandemic preparedness is an active, continuous commitment, not a document to be filed away. Part I. The Gathering Storm. Pre-January 2020. Chapter 1. A Legacy of Forewarning. The concept of a devastating pandemic was not a novelty in the 21st century. It was a recurring nightmare in the halls of epidemiology, and a constant subject of strategic planning within the U.S. government. The specter of the 1918 influenza pandemic, which killed an estimated 50 million people worldwide, served as the ultimate cautionary tale. But more recent events provided fresher, more urgent warnings. The 2003 SARS, Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome, outbreak, another coronavirus, demonstrated how quickly a regional health issue could become a global threat. The 2009 H1N1 swine flu pandemic tested the nation's response capabilities directly. The 2012 MERS, Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, outbreak, and most terrifyingly, the 2014 Ebola crisis in West Africa, showcased the lethality of novel pathogens and the absolute necessity of a swift, coordinated, and globally minded response. Each of these events spurred a new round of analysis, funding, and planning. After H1N1, the Obama administration conducted a thorough review of its response, leading to strengthened ties between federal and state public health agencies. The Ebola crisis, which saw a handful of cases reach American shores and incite widespread public fear, was a particularly galvanizing moment. It exposed weaknesses in hospital preparedness and the complexities of quarantine and contact tracing in a modern, interconnected society. It was in the crucible of these experiences that the Playbook for Early Response to High-Consequence Emerging Infectious Disease Threats and Biological Incidents was forged. In 2016, a dedicated working group within the National Security Council, NSC, comprising career civil servants, public health experts from the CDC and NIH, intelligence analysts, and officials from the Departments of Defense, Homeland Security, and Health and Human Services, was tasked with creating a document that would transcend partisan politics. Their mission was to distill the hard-won lessons of past crises into a simple, actionable guide for future White House leaders who might not have a background in public health. Dr. Beth Cameron, who helmed this effort, and her team operated on a few core principles. First, speed is paramount. In a pandemic, every lost hour allows for exponential growth of the virus. The playbook was designed to jumpstart the decision-making process, to get the right people in a room asking the right questions immediately. Second, coordination is non-negotiable. A pandemic response involves a bewildering array of government agencies. The playbook was intended to be the central coordinating document, ensuring that the right hand knew what the left hand was doing, from managing the strategic national stockpile to issuing clear travel advisories. Third, communication must be centralized, credible, and science-based. Public trust is the most valuable currency in a public health crisis, and the playbook stressed the importance of having designated scientific experts as the primary communicators. The resulting 69-page document was intentionally concise. It was not a dense 1,000-page tome of bureaucratic procedure. It was, as one of its authors later described it, pandemics for dummies. It used color-coded threat levels, simple checklists, and decision trees. It posed direct questions that a president or national security advisor should be asking in the first 24 hours, the first week, the first month. Do we have a diagnostic test? If not, what is the plan to develop and scale one? What is the status of our personal protective equipment, PPE supply, in the strategic national stockpile? Have we engaged with manufacturers to scale up production of ventilators and other critical medical supplies? What is our communication strategy to the American people and to state and local governments? The playbook was a generational transfer of knowledge, a baton passed from one administration to the next. It represented a bipartisan consensus that pandemic preparedness was a matter of national security, as critical as maintaining a strong military or a stable economy. It was placed on the shelf at the National Security Council, a break glass in case of emergency tool, waiting for a crisis that its authors knew was not a matter of if, but when. Chapter 2. The Dissolution of a Shield. In the spring of 2018, a significant reorganization took place within the National Security Council. The Directorate for Global Health Security and Biodefense, the very office that had produced the playbook and was the institutional home for pandemic preparedness at the highest level of the White House, was disbanded. The decision, made under then National Security Advisor John Bolton, was framed as a move to streamline operations and reduce bureaucratic layering. The Directorate's senior staff were reassigned to other parts of the NSC, and its responsibilities were absorbed into broader directorates covering counterproliferation and biodefense. Proponents of the move argued that the expertise was not lost, merely redistributed. They claimed the new structure was more efficient. However, critics, including many former public health officials and biosecurity experts, warned that the reorganization was a grave mistake. It dismantled the one entity that had a singular focus on pandemic threat. It removed the quarterback, the senior-level director who had the authority and the president's ear to coordinate the sprawling interagency response that a pandemic would require. Without that central high-level champion, the issue of pandemic preparedness was inevitably downgraded in priority, lost amidst more immediate geopolitical concerns. This structural weakness was thrown into stark relief during a multi-state pandemic exercise run by the Department of Health and Human Services in 2019. The exercise, codenamed Crimson Contagion, simulated a severe influenza pandemic originating in China. The scenario involved a novel flu virus brought back to the U.S. by tourists, rapidly spreading and overwhelming the healthcare system. Federal, state, and local agencies participated in the simulation, which ran from January to August. The findings of the draft after-action report, obtained by journalists, were chillingly prescient. The exercise revealed deep, systemic vulnerabilities in the nation's readiness. Participants were confused about the lines of authority between the federal government and the states. Federal agencies were slow to provide resources and guidance. There was a critical shortage of testing capacity in the early stages of the simulated outbreak, and most alarmingly, the simulation predicted that the nation's supply of PPE, particularly masks and gowns, would be exhausted almost immediately, leading to a catastrophic breakdown in healthcare delivery. The report highlighted a fundamental lack of coordination and a supply chain that was dangerously reliant on overseas manufacturing. The Crimson Contagion exercise was a full dress rehearsal for the disaster to come. It was a clear, unambiguous warning that the systems in place were inadequate. It validated every concern that had led to the creation of the 2016 Playbook. Yet, in the months following the exercise, no major, urgent reforms were implemented. The after-action report was circulated within government, but its stark warnings failed to catalyze the kind of top-to-bottom overhaul that was needed. The shield had been weakened by the NSC reorganization, and the Crimson Contagion report revealed just how full of holes it was. The nation was flying into a hurricane, having ignored the weather forecast and dismantled parts of its radar system. Chapter 3. The First Whispers from Wuhan. December 2019. As 2019 drew to a close, the first signals of the impending crisis began to emerge from Wuhan, a sprawling industrial metropolis in central China. Doctors in the city started noticing a cluster of patients with a mysterious pneumonia that wasn't responding to standard treatments. On December 30, Dr. Li Wenliang, an ophthalmologist at Wuhan Central Hospital, sent a message to a group of fellow medical school alumni, warning them about a SARS-like illness and advising them to wear protective gear. His message quickly went viral, and just as quickly, he was silenced by Chinese authorities for spreading rumors. But the whispers could not be contained. By early January 2020, these reports began to filter into the U.S. intelligence community. The National Center for Medical Intelligence, NCMI, a component of the Defense Intelligence Agency, flagged the outbreak as a serious concern. Analysts who spent their careers monitoring global health threats saw the telltale signs: a novel pathogen, reports of human-to-human transmission, and a government attempting to control the narrative. This intelligence was not relegated to obscure reports. According to extensive reporting by multiple news outlets, the warnings about the Wuhan virus were included in the President's Daily Brief, PDB, the highest-level intelligence summary prepared for the President and his top advisors on numerous occasions throughout January, February. While the White House later claimed these briefings contained no explicit warnings, the intelligence community's job is to present data and analysis, not to dictate policy. The inclusion of the virus in the PDB signified that the intelligence community viewed it as a significant potential threat to U.S. national security. The problem was one of signal versus noise. For policymakers in Washington, the world is a constant cacophony of potential threats. On any given day, they are dealing with terrorism, cyber attacks, nuclear proliferation, and great power competition. An obscure respiratory virus in a Chinese city thousands of miles away could easily seem like a low-priority issue, especially to a leadership not steeped in the science of epidemiology. This is precisely the scenario the Playbook was designed to overcome. Its color-coded threat matrix and simple checklists were created to cut through the noise, to elevate a biological threat to the highest level of attention when certain triggers were met. A novel pathogen with evidence of human-to-human transmission was one of those key triggers. Had the Playbook been the active guiding document for the NSC, the first PDB mention of the Wuhan virus should have prompted the National Security Advisor to open it to page 1 and begin asking the prescribed questions. Instead, a pervasive sense of normalcy bias and optimism bias seemed to take hold. Normalcy bias is the cognitive tendency to believe that things will continue to function in the future the way they have in the past, leading us to underestimate both the likelihood of a disaster and its potential effect. Optimism bias is the belief that one is less likely to experience a negative event. The thinking within the administration appeared to be that this was another distant outbreak, like SARS or MERS, that would be contained overseas and would not significantly impact the United States. This magical thinking, as Jeremy Conondike, an expert in international disasters, described it, was the foundational error upon which all subsequent failures were built. While the intelligence community was waving a red flag, the leadership in Washington saw only a sea of green. Part 2. The Lost Months. January-February 2020. Chapter 4. The Illusion of Control. January 2020 was a month of fatal complacency. While the virus was seeding itself across the globe, carried by asymptomatic travelers on thousands of commercial flights, the official posture of the United States government was one of detached confidence. The national conversation was dominated by the presidential impeachment trial, and the economy was strong. The threat from Wuhan seemed abstract and remote. On January 21, the CDC confirmed the first known case of coronavirus in the United States, a man in Washington state who had recently returned from Wuhan. The very next day, in an interview from Davos, Switzerland, President Trump was asked if he was worried about a potential pandemic. His response set the tone for the weeks to come. No, not at all. We have it totally under control. It's one person coming in from China, and we have it under control. It's going to be just fine. This public assurance stood in stark contrast to the growing alarm within the public health and national security communities. Scientists at the CDC and NIH were watching the data coming out of China with dread. They saw a virus that was far more transmissible than SARS, and was spreading with terrifying speed. The Chinese government's decision to lock down Wuhan, a city of 11 million people, on January 23 was an unprecedented measure that signaled the gravity of the situation. It was a desperate act by an authoritarian regime that had lost control of the outbreak. The Trump administration's signature response during this period was the implementation of a travel ban on foreign nationals who had recently been to China, which went into effect on January 31. The administration would later point to this decision as a pivotal action that saved countless lives. And while the travel restrictions likely did prevent some infected individuals from entering the country, it was a dangerously incomplete solution. First, the ban was full of exemptions. It did not apply to U.S. citizens or permanent residents, tens of thousands of whom returned to the U.S. from China after the ban was in place, with inconsistent screening and no enforced quarantine. Second, and more critically, the focus on China ignored the fact that the virus was already global. By late January, COVID-19 was circulating widely in Europe. Flight data analysis later revealed that the primary source of the massive outbreak in New York City was not travelers from China, but from Italy and other European countries. The virus had found a back door, and the U.S. had left it wide open. The travel ban created an illusion of control. It made it seem as though the government was taking decisive action to keep the virus out, while ignoring the far more important task of preparing for the virus that was already in. The precious time bought by the travel restrictions, and it was, at best, a matter of weeks, was squandered. The administration did not use that time to launch a national effort to scale up testing, ramp up production of PPE, or prepare hospitals for a patient surge. Instead, it engaged in wishful thinking, with the president repeatedly suggesting the virus would weaken with warmer weather and miraculously disappear. January and the first half of February were the lost months, a period of inaction that would prove to be catastrophic. Chapter 5. The Catastrophic Failure of Testing. Of all the missteps in the early U.S. response, none was more consequential than the failure to deploy widespread diagnostic testing. Testing is the cornerstone of any pandemic response. It is the tool that allows public health officials to see the invisible enemy to find out who is sick, where the virus is spreading, and who needs to be isolated. Without testing, containment is impossible. You cannot fight what you cannot see. The Playbook explicitly addresses this on page 32, posing the question of whether states have sufficient diagnostic capability. In January and February 2020, the answer was a resounding no. Initially, the only lab in the entire country that could test for SARS-CoV-2 was at the CDC headquarters in Atlanta. The CDC, historically a world leader in public health, followed its standard procedure of developing its own highly accurate test to distribute to state and local public health labs. On February 6, nearly 3 weeks after the first U.S. case was identified, the CDC began shipping these test kits. But within days, a disaster unfolded. State labs reported that the tests were producing inconclusive results. It was soon discovered that one of the chemical reagents in the test kits had been contaminated during the manufacturing process at the CDC lab, rendering them unreliable. This technical flaw was a serious setback, but the more profound failure was systemic. The U.S. had put all its eggs in one basket. While the CDC struggled to fix its faulty test, a powerful network of other potential testing centers, academic university labs, private clinical labs was sitting on the sidelines, legally barred from developing and using their own tests by cumbersome FDA regulations. Dr. Alex Greninger at the University of Washington Virology Lab in Seattle was one of many scientists across the country who saw the freight train coming. His lab, like many others, had the expertise and equipment to develop its own COVID-19 test based on the genetic sequence of the virus, which China had published in early January, but they were caught in a bureaucratic catch-22. The FDA's Emergency Use Authorization, EUA process, designed to ensure tests are accurate, was too slow and inflexible for a fast-moving pandemic. For weeks, labs like Greninger's were pleading with the FDA and CDC to cut through the red tape and allow them to start testing. The contrast with other developed nations was stark. South Korea, which had identified its first case on the exact same day as the U.S., took a completely different approach. Drawing on its experience with the MERS outbreak, the South Korean government immediately convened a meeting with private diagnostic companies and gave them the green light to begin mass-producing tests. They set up drive-through testing centers and deployed a massive public health campaign to test, trace, and isolate cases. By the end of February, South Korea had conducted nearly 100,000 tests. The United States, a nation of 330 million people, had tested only 472. The consequences of this testing vacuum were devastating. With no ability to see the scope of the problem, the virus spread silently and exponentially. Community transmission was well underway long before it was officially acknowledged. The first known U.S. death from COVID-19, a woman in San Jose, California, occurred on February 6, the same day the CDC's faulty tests were being shipped out. Her death was initially attributed to a heart attack and was only confirmed as COVID-related by a post-mortem autopsy weeks later. How many others were there? We will never know. The lack of testing created a false sense of security, allowing the virus to become deeply entrenched in communities across the country before any significant public health measures were taken. Chapter 6. The unseen spread. With the nation flying blind due to the lack of testing, the virus was writing its own playbook, exploiting every opportunity to spread through the dense networks of modern American life. This unseen spread was accelerated by a series of super spreader events gatherings, where a single infected individual transmitted the virus to a large number of people. In late February, the biotech company Biogen held a leadership conference in a Boston hotel. Nearly 200 executives attended meetings, shook hands, and shared meals. An infected person was among them. The virus ripped through the conference, and the attendees then flew home to their respective states and countries, seeding new outbreaks wherever they went. Genetic analysis later linked this single event to an estimated 300,000 cases across the United States. In New Rochelle, New York, a lawyer attended services at his synagogue while unknowingly infected. He became patient zero for a massive outbreak in the community, which became one of the first containment zones in the country. In Albany, Georgia, a funeral in late February became a nexus of transmission. An infected person from out of town attended, and the virus spread among the mourners, who then took it back to their own churches and communities. The outbreak overwhelmed the small city's hospital and resulted in one of the highest per capita death rates in the world. And then there were the massive public gatherings. In New Orleans, Mardi Gras went ahead as planned, drawing over 1 million revelers to the city's crowded streets and bars. It became a viral inferno, seeding outbreaks throughout the Gulf South as tourists returned home. In Florida, beaches remained packed with spring break vacationers well into March, creating another perfect storm for transmission. These events were not isolated incidents. They were a reflection of a national mindset, assured by leaders that the risk was low and that everything was under control. Most Americans carried on with their lives. Among them were the individuals whose stories form the human heart of this crisis. In Queens, New York, Carla Duarte, a vibrant high school student, had just celebrated a joyous Sweet 16 party. She was looking forward to spring break, completely unaware that she was living in a city that was about to become the global epicenter of the pandemic. She continued to attend school until the middle of March, riding the crowded subways, sharing classrooms with hundreds of other students. In Albany, Georgia, Terica Parks, a young mother and singer, was, in her own words, living her best life. She performed at a church youth program in early March, a community gathering filled with hope and faith. Days later, she was fighting for her life with COVID-19, a victim of the outbreak that began at the local funeral. And in New Jersey, Felicia Temple, a talented singer who had gained fame on the TV show The Voice, was living her dream on a European tour. She was also a registered nurse. As she heard the news of the worsening crisis back home, she would soon be faced with a choice: to continue her dream or to return to the front lines of a nightmare. Their lives, like millions of others, were about to be irrevocably altered by a virus that had been allowed to spread, unseen and unchecked, during the lost months of January and February. The opportunity for containment had passed. The nation was now on a collision course with a full-blown catastrophe. Part 3. The Deluge. March 2020. Chapter 7. The Communication Breakdown. As February turned to March, the cognitive dissonance between the reality of the escalating global crisis and the reassuring rhetoric from Washington became untenable. The virus was no longer a distant threat. It was here, and it was spreading. This demanded a sharp pivot in communication, a moment of national clarity and unified purpose. Instead, the nation received a confusing patchwork of mixed messages, politically charged statements, and a dangerous downplaying of the threat. The first major crack in the facade of control came on February 25, when Dr. Nancy Messonnier, a veteran CDC official and head of the agency's task force, gave a starkly honest briefing to reporters. She warned the American people that community spread was inevitable and that disruption to everyday life may be severe. She told them that businesses, schools, and communities needed to start planning for measures like teleschooling and canceling public events. It was the first time a high-level federal official had spoken directly to the public about the true scale of the impending crisis. The backlash from the White House was swift and severe. The stock market tumbled on her remarks, and President Trump was reportedly furious at her candor. The administration saw her message as alarmist and damaging to the economy. The very next day, a full press conference was convened, with the president, vice president, and other top officials, largely to walk back Dr. Messonnier's warning. The president announced that Vice President Mike Pence would lead the coronavirus task force, and reiterated that the number of cases was low and would soon be close to zero. The message was clear. The primary concern was controlling the narrative and preventing public panic, rather than preparing the public for the hard realities to come. This incident established a pattern that would define the administration's communication strategy. The White House task force began holding daily televised press briefings, but instead of being a source of clear, science-based information, they frequently became a theater of political messaging. The president often took center stage, contradicting his own public health experts on issues ranging from the timeline of the virus to the potential efficacy of unproven treatments like hydroxychloroquine. The Playbook's guidance on communication to have single, designated, science-based communicators was utterly disregarded. Dr. Anthony Fauci, the nation's top infectious disease expert, and Dr. Deborah Birx, the task force coordinator, were often placed in the awkward position of standing behind the president as he made scientifically inaccurate statements. Their attempts to gently correct the record or provide nuanced information were often lost in the noise. This communication breakdown had dire consequences. It sowed confusion and eroded public trust in scientific institutions like the CDC. When the federal government failed to provide a clear, unified message, a leadership vacuum emerged, which was filled by governors and mayors. This led to a patchwork response across the country. On March 16, the federal government finally issued its 15 days to slow the spread guidelines, recommending social distancing. But by then, the virus was raging. A Columbia University study later estimated that if these measures had been implemented just 1 week earlier, 36,000 lives could have been saved. The delay was a direct result of a communication strategy that prioritized optimistic projections over scientific warnings. Chapter 8. The Scramble for Scraps. The PPE Crisis. As hospitals began to fill with critically ill COVID-19 patients in March, a second, parallel crisis erupted: a catastrophic shortage of personal protective equipment, PPE. The masks, gowns, gloves, and face shields that protect healthcare workers from infection became as precious as gold. The scenes from the front lines were shocking. Nurses wearing trash bags as makeshift gowns, doctors reusing single-use N95 masks for days or even weeks, their faces bruised from the constant pressure. This was not an unforeseeable problem. It was, in fact, one of the most predictable consequences of a respiratory pandemic. Both the 2016 Playbook and the 2019 Crimson Contagion exercise had explicitly identified PPE shortages as a critical vulnerability. The Strategic National Stockpile, SNS, was supposed to be the nation's emergency backstop, but it was woefully undersupplied, having been depleted during the H1N1 pandemic and never fully replenished. The administration was slow to react. In January and February, even as the World Health Organization warned of a looming global PPE shortage, the U.S. continued to ship tons of PPE overseas to China. The first federal government purchase order for new N95 masks was not placed until March 12, by which point global supply chains had seized up and domestic demand was exploding. The White House's reluctance to take centralized control of the supply chain created a Lord of the Flies scenario for the states. With no federal coordination, all 50 governors were forced to compete against each other and against the federal government itself in a chaotic global marketplace. Prices skyrocketed. Desperate hospital administrators found themselves dealing with shady brokers and unvetted suppliers. Shipments were hijacked, and states were outbid by FEMA at the last minute. Into this vacuum stepped a new task force run by the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner. Composed of young private sector volunteers with little experience in government procurement or logistics, the task force sought to apply a business world mindset to the problem. But their efforts were often opaque and added to the confusion. Meanwhile, a remarkable grassroots movement emerged. People like Eric Ries, a Silicon Valley entrepreneur, launched volunteer efforts like the PPE Coalition. They worked around the clock, connecting grassroots makers with 3D printers to hospitals in need, vetting suppliers, and trying to build new supply chains from scratch. It was an inspiring display of American ingenuity and civic spirit. but it was also a damning indictment of the federal government's failure to perform one of its most basic functions in a crisis. As Rees put it, "We always thought the cavalry was coming, but the cavalry never came." The government's response was not just a B-, it was a catastrophic failure. Healthcare workers, the nation's last line of defense, were sent into battle unarmed. The moral injury of this abandonment would linger long after the first wave of the virus had passed. Chapter 9. The Epicenter, a City Under Siege. By mid-March, New York City had become the undisputed global epicenter of the pandemic. The virus, which had been circulating undetected for weeks, primarily from European travelers, exploded with a ferocity that stunned even seasoned public health experts. The city's density, its reliance on public transportation, and its role as an international crossroads made it uniquely vulnerable. The city's leadership, like the federal government, was slow to grasp the magnitude of the threat. Governor Andrew Cuomo and Mayor Bill de Blasio hesitated to take drastic measures like closing the nation's largest school system, fearing the economic and social consequences. By the time a statewide stay-at-home order was issued on March 22, there were already over 16,000 confirmed cases, and the city's hospitals were on the verge of collapse. The sound of constant ambulance sirens became the soundtrack of the city. Hospitals in Queens and the Bronx were completely overwhelmed. Emergency rooms were packed with people struggling to breathe. Hallways were lined with gurneys. The demand for ventilators quickly outstripped the supply, forcing doctors into the horrific position of making battlefield triage decisions about who would get a chance to live and who would be left to die. Refrigerated trucks were parked outside hospitals to serve as makeshift morgues for the dead. This was the war zone that Felicia Temple, the singer and nurse from New Jersey, voluntarily returned to. She went back to work at Holy Name Medical Center in Teaneck, a hospital that was at the heart of New Jersey's own brutal outbreak. She witnessed the unimaginable toll the virus took on patients and their families. Because of the highly infectious nature of the disease, family members were not allowed to visit their dying loved ones. Nurses like Felicia had to become surrogates, holding the hands of dying patients, holding up iPads for final, heartbreaking video calls. She saw the virus cut down not just the elderly and frail, but the young and healthy as well, and she saw it devastate her own hospital family. She describes the moment she saw a beloved hospital treasure, 5-year-old patient transporter Jesus Villaluz, being admitted as a COVID patient. He would later die in the same hospital he had dedicated his life to serving. The image of his body being wheeled through the hospital corridors, lined with his grieving colleagues paying their last respects, became an iconic symbol of the sacrifice of frontline workers. It was in one of these besieged New York City hospitals that Carla Duarte, the Queen's teenager, found herself fighting for her life. A few short weeks after her Sweet 16 party, she was diagnosed with the virus. Her condition deteriorated rapidly. A healthy teenager was suddenly struggling to breathe, her lungs failing. She was placed on a ventilator, but even that wasn't enough. Doctors told her mother, Anna, that her last chance was an ECMO machine, a highly invasive form of life support that oxygenates the blood outside the body. It was a 50/50 chance. For Anna, and for thousands of families across the city, the abstract numbers on the news had become a terrifyingly personal reality. Carla's fight for survival mirrored the city's own desperate struggle against a relentless and invisible enemy. Chapter 10. The Ripple Effect. While New York City's crisis captured the world's attention, the virus was not a purely metropolitan problem. It was silently and devastatingly working its way into smaller cities and rural communities across America, often with even more tragic consequences. These communities frequently had fewer resources, older populations, and less access to advanced medical care. The outbreak in Albany, Georgia, was a case study in how quickly the virus could overwhelm a smaller community. Sparked by the late February funeral, the virus spread like wildfire through the city's close-knit social and religious networks. The city's one major hospital, Phoebe Putney Memorial, was quickly inundated. It was a disaster on the scale of what was happening in New York, but concentrated in a community of just 75,000 people. It was here that Terica Park's life was upended. After performing at her church, she fell ill with excruciating body aches and a high fever. She ended up in the same overwhelmed hospital, terrified and alone. From her hospital bed, she started a video diary, a poignant record of her fear and her desperate will to live, to get back to her husband and children. Her story highlighted a grim reality of the pandemic. The virus was disproportionately sickening and killing people of color. Systemic health and social inequities, higher rates of pre-existing conditions, jobs that couldn't be done from home, denser living situations put Black and Latino communities at far higher risk. The ripple effect continued across the country. An outbreak linked to a choir practice near Seattle demonstrated the danger of indoor gatherings. A cluster of cases tied to family gatherings in Chicago showed how the virus exploited our most intimate social connections. In the Navajo Nation, the virus spread with devastating speed, fueled by multi-generational homes and a lack of access to running water for frequent hand-washing. Each of these outbreaks was a tragedy that could have been mitigated, if not prevented. With widespread testing and effective contact tracing, the sparks could have been extinguished before they became infernos. With clear public health messaging about the dangers of large gatherings, events like the funeral in Albany might have been postponed or held differently. But in the absence of a coherent national strategy, each community was left to fend for itself, and the virus continued its relentless, deadly advance across the American landscape. Terica Parks was one of the lucky ones. She survived. After weeks in the hospital, she was discharged, an experience she described as a rebirth, but she left behind a community shattered by loss, a stark reminder of the virus's devastating reach. Part 4. The Reckoning. Chapter 11. A Dialogue with Power. In mid-May 2020, with the U.S. death toll approaching 100,000, Secretary of Health and Human Services Alex Azar sat down for an interview to defend the administration's response. His remarks provide a crucial window into the official narrative constructed by the White House and offer a stark contrast to the facts established by the timeline of events. When confronted with the staggering death toll, Secretary Azar's first response was to contextualize the numbers by pointing to the size of the country. He then quickly pivoted to blaming China, arguing that the Chinese government's lack of transparency about human-to-human and asymptomatic transmission was the root cause of the global crisis. While China's early cover-up is well documented and indefensible, this argument served to deflect from the critical question of what the U.S. government did, or failed to do, with the information it did have. By early January, the world knew this was a novel coronavirus, and the possibility of a pandemic was already being discussed by experts. The secretary insisted that the administration had taken all the right steps from the beginning, claiming they scaled up the NSC, activated the CDC's emergency operations, and began outreach to PPE manufacturers in January. However, this claim is contradicted by the evidence. The first federal purchase orders for N95 masks did not appear in government databases until March. When pressed for documentation of earlier purchases, his office did not provide any. The scaling up he described did not translate into the tangible results tests, masks, ventilators that were desperately needed. Regarding the 2016 pandemic playbook, Secretary Azar dismissed it as a rather thin document that his administration had found inadequate, claiming they had replaced it with more robust plans. This is a misleading characterization. The playbook's brevity was its strength. It was designed as a high-level strategic guide for White House leaders, not a detailed operational plan. Furthermore, many of the core principles in the playbook, the need for early testing, PPE procurement, and clear communication were also present in the administration's own plans, yet they were not executed in a timely manner. The failure was not one of planning, but of implementation. On the critical issue of testing, the Secretary conceded that time was lost due to the CDC's flawed test kits. But he excused the vast disparity in testing numbers between the US and South Korea by arguing that South Korea is a smaller country with a more localized outbreak. While true, this ignores the fundamental difference in strategy. South Korea leveraged its private sector and moved with incredible speed, while the US remained mired in a centralized, bureaucratic approach that failed. He claimed the US testing system was not built for a novel pandemic, an astonishing admission that directly contradicts the years of planning that had been done for precisely such an event. Finally, when presented with the modeling that showed an earlier implementation of social distancing could have saved tens of thousands of lives, the Secretary again deflected, suggesting that New York State officials were to blame for not acting sooner to mitigate the spread from Europe. This ignored the reality that state officials were operating in an information vacuum, receiving no clear direction or sense of urgency from the federal government. The interview was a masterclass in deflection, half-truths, and the rewriting of history. It revealed an administration unwilling or unable to engage in an honest self-assessment of its own missteps, preferring instead to blame external actors and praise its own efforts, despite the devastating human toll. Chapter 12. Lessons Unlearned? Lessons for the Future. The story of the early U.S. Response to the COVID-19 pandemic is a tragedy in 4 acts. A failure of imagination, a failure of leadership, a failure of logistics, and a failure of communication. It is a story of a nation that had the resources, the expertise, and even a step-by-step guide to confront a pandemic, but which failed to muster the political will and operational competence to do so effectively. The Playbook, that 69-page distillation of hard-won knowledge, was not just ignored. Its very ethos was rejected. It called for respecting science, and science was politicized. It called for clear, unified communication, and the nation was subjected to a cacophony of contradiction. It called for swift, early action, and the leadership chose to delay and downplay. It called for centralized coordination, and the response was fragmented and chaotic. The virus wrote its own playbook, one that was random, cruel, and brutally efficient. It exploited every seam in our social fabric, every weakness in our political system, and every flaw in our public health infrastructure. The human cost of this failure is measured in the more than 100,000 lives lost in those first few months, and the hundreds of thousands more that would follow. It is measured in the grief of families, the burnout of healthcare workers, the economic ruin of small businesses, and the lost education of a generation of children. Carla Duarte survived. After weeks on a ventilator and an ECMO machine, she rallied and went home, beginning the long, slow process of recovery. Terica Parks survived, leaving the hospital with a profound sense of having been given a second chance at life. But their stories, and the story of this nation, are forever marked by the what-ifs. What if the warnings from the intelligence community had been heeded in January? What if the CDC's test had worked? Or if private labs had been unleashed sooner? What if the strategic national stockpile had been full? What if leaders had leveled with the American people from the start? As Lester Holt concluded in the Dateline report, perhaps it is time to write a new kind of playbook, but its contents should not be a surprise. They would be the same principles that have always been at the heart of effective crisis management. Heed the warnings. Invest in and empower the institutions from the intelligence community to public health agencies that are designed to provide early warnings. When they speak, leaders must listen. Maintain a permanent infrastructure. Pandemic preparedness cannot be a part-time concern. A senior-level, empowered office within the White House, with a singular focus on global health security, is essential. Invest in public health. A robust, Well-funded public health system at the federal, state, and local levels is the bedrock of any pandemic response. This includes everything from modernizing data systems to ensuring adequate laboratory capacity. Secure supply chains. The nation must never again be reliant on foreign adversaries for critical supplies like PPE and pharmaceuticals. A combination of domestic manufacturing incentives and a vastly expanded, well-managed national stockpile is a national security imperative. Restore trust in science. Public health decisions must be driven by data and evidence, not politics. Leaders must commit to elevating the voices of scientific experts and protecting them from political pressure. The COVID-19 pandemic was a test, and the United States failed. But it does not have to be a final grade. It can be a lesson. An honest accounting of what went wrong is the first, essential step toward ensuring that when the next pandemic comes, the outcome will be different. The unread playbook from 2016 is now stained with the tragedy of 2020. The task for the future is to write a new one and to have the courage and wisdom to follow it. The unread playbook. A tragedy in 4 acts. Prologue. The prophecy on the shelf. In the winter foreword, as in the slept, a ghost was stirring. It was a phantom born in the wet markets of Wuhan, an invisible predator that moved through the breath of unsuspecting travelers, crossing oceans on the wings of commerce and connection. It wizard watched a name that meant nothing, that would soon mean everything. ETAS, a novel coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2, B-Globe, a silent, microscopic army laying siege to nations. Economies, built over centuries, would be brought to their knees. Societies, woven together by the threads of human contact, would be torn asunder. Andost Ord, and societies were armed fundamentally altered. The might, unimaginable wealth, and a deep reservoir of intellectual power, deep well of I was about to unfold. It would become a monument to failure, a tragedintellectual.ca, proportions that would leave more poor its citizens dead than others, ultim on earth. To that death a story that can be told with the cold comfort of hindsight. It is not to academical of any country in T-blame. Sice in assigning BL real, and blinding miasma that descends in any crisis, especially one conjured by eye crisis. P never before seen by human eyes. Decisions are forged in the crucible o' farce and fear. Evolve only fragments of truth to guide the hand. But this was not a surprise attack. This was a tragedy foretold. Preparedness rusher sacred with incomplete data. However, preparedness is staring into the abysses, the unimaginable and not flinching. It is the work of the discipline of imagining imaginable, bulwarks against the storm, of creating systems so of planny they can function, when all else fails. And the United States had prepared. It had been warned. At the heart of this story, sitting on a shelf within the nerve center, our American Power, was a document, a 69-page oracle. It was known a CESPO Pandemic Playbook, a guide forged in the fires of past plagues by a bipartisan congregation Iluan, nation's sharpest minds. It was not suggestion. It was a testament, written with the ink of hard-won experience. It was a failure map out of the very labyrinth the world was about to enter. It was a fire alarm, polished and waiting to be pulled. This is the story of why that alarm fell silent. This is the deconstruction of Chris' fatal decisions and the unforgivable indecisions that marked the path from Thais that unfolded. A strange new pneumoniere alarm wait. Sirens began to wail, unabated, in the streets of the anal greatest cities. We will descend in tot. Alarm was unearthing verheated. Communiques, confronting the critical decisions made bearing witness to and not cost. We will piece together the portrait of a superpower of utterly overwhelm the nation's healthcare system By examining the timeline, the stories you will read here of a teenage girl fighting for breaths, we will piece together, leaving her dream behind to walk back into her nightmare of a lack of consumed by the fire or a lack of will to listen. The stories of individuals' receipts for a debt of inaction. They are Theatine Pricerl fighting for he to gather duster a shelf. This is an accounting, a deep dive into the anatomy of a failure, undertaken so that we may learn from the wreckage, because the ghosts of Thises, they see of haunt us for a generation. And the next plague is not a matter of if, but when. The playbook was written once. It cannot be ignored again. Executive Summary. The Indictment. This report is an autopsy of the initial United States response to the COVID-19 pandemic, a forensic examination of the critical period from the final days of 2019 through the spring of 2020. It finds that the cataclysm that befell the nation was not an unavoidable act of nature. It weighs odd F. Directrum December